And I'm Libby Casey with the Washington Post, and it's really a privilege to be on stage with these two transformers and leaders in food and sustainability. We're talking about market forces, and as we look at consumption, production, sustainability, they all play a role. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Kathleen Merrigan, Executive Director of Sustainability at George Washington University. She also served as U.S. Deputy Secretary of Agriculture from 2009 to 2013. We're also joined by Dr. Mary Bohman, Administrator of the Economic Research Service, USDA's intramural social science research and statistical agency. A lot of words to say that you two have been spending decades working on these issues at a time when it wasn't in the public eye as much as it certainly is now. So to get our conversation started, let's just talk about what is transformative right now in food and as we look to the future.
You're asking me?
I am.
Okay.
The eyes weren't enough.
So there are all kinds of things shaking up the system right now. Lots of mergers and acquisitions. There's a sense that it's very hard to be an old, stable, big brand. People are very interested in new products, new companies. There's a flood of venture capital coming into the food space. A lot of the venture capitalists are coming from the tech world. They're actually not all that informed about food, and they're looking to become experts and invest in ways that disrupt the current enterprise. A lot of interest in transparency, a lot of interest in alternative proteins, concern about meat consumption and projections if the world, as it develops, increases meat consumption in really big ways. That's going to have profound impacts on our planetary health. So what kind of alternative plant-based proteins might be a substitute? I don't know, clean labels. People are very concerned when they see all that scientific language, those big words on labels that they don't understand. And so there's a sense that they want fresh, they want as close as possible that connect to the farmer, to the table. There's a lot more interest in flavor, a lot more interest in ethnic food as our country demographics change. Go ahead, Mary. There's a few I could add.
Well, I think you bring up a lot of things that, while they're current interests, they draw on long-term trends in food and agriculture and things that we've been monitoring at the Economic Research Service. One is that in 1970, about a quarter of the food Americans bought, or a quarter of our food dollar went to food away from home. It's now almost 50%. That's a big transformation. Half of what we buy in the grocery store is food that's almost ready to eat or ready to eat. So we're really driven a lot by changing income, changing family structures, smaller families, that the way we eat is very different. And some of these trends, these newer things are really play to this desire to have more novel foods, more ready to eat, things that make food more something that's part of our experience. But we're really a diverse country, and we monitor at ERS the food security of the nation. And about 13% of Americans are food insecure, and their purchasing is so different from people who are in the top 20% of income. They spend about $3,000 a year on food. It's 30% of their total income. People like me who are in the top 20%, we spend almost $12,000 a year on food, and it's about 10 or 11% of our income that we have. So it's a really interesting picture that's supporting these kind of trends.
I'd like to follow up on that in just a moment, but I want to remind our audience that you can join this conversation if you'd like to weigh in. You can join us on Twitter, use the hashtag #PostLive, or you can post comments on our Facebook Live feed, put them in the comment section, and we'll be able to hopefully run a couple by our guests. As we look at that disparity, I mean, it's so fascinating. Many Americans are trying to get more in touch with where their food comes from. We think of the farm-to-table movement, but it does seem that we are getting more and more removed from our food sources when you just don't have the time and the money to almost have the luxury to trace that back. I'd be curious to hear what you have to think about that disparity that we're seeing at the income levels.
Well, one thing I'll say, and this is based on Economic Research Service data, there is a difference in terms of what people eat from high income, but lower income and middle income people, especially in terms of fruits and vegetables, which we're all pushing, right? The rule is half a plate of fruits and vegetables. That's our new dietary guidance. There's not a huge difference between low income and middle income people. So I think that's an important thing to know, because in the political climate, with a lot of people focused on potential cuts or reforms to the SNAP program, I think that there is this idea that low-income people eat very differently than the rest of Americans, and the data just doesn't support that. I think people are really looking for authenticity in their food, to go to your point about that real distance between where food is produced and where it's consumed, and that's why they're really looking for food with a story. And when you see a lot of these new companies, they're really very focused on their storyline, their niche. Being big is not necessarily good anymore. And I think that's been something that has been challenging to the organic industry, which I have a lot of my soul in over the years, as the organic industry has grown to huge proportions. The good news is you can buy organic in almost every place across the country in all kinds of stores, from Target to Walmart to the specialty mom and pop organic co-op. It means that it's accessible to many more people, but it has also, in some ways, confused the storyline of organic being little, kind of fighting against the man, if you will. You know, it's the resistance movement. It is now mainstream, and so what does that mean? So I think people are looking for that connect, that story, that direct marketing connection, if at all possible.
Is it a real connection to our food, or are we looking for something to make us feel like we're connected to our food? Are we more connected now than we were 20 years ago?
20 years ago, I'm not sure there's such a huge difference, but one thing that is different is the change in who are farmers. You know, at the post-World War II, people in rural areas were a much higher percentage of our total population. There are a lot more farmers. You know, I started out teaching agriculture in the or 1990. If you asked students in the class who grew up on a farm, you'd see half the hands. Even a decade later, it would be ones or twos. So, you know, my father grew up on a farm, but I'm probably atypical, and you have fewer people who have that direct background and that connection. But nonetheless, most of Americans' farms are family farms. We have about over 2 million farms in the US. 99% are families. That means they're owned by people who are related to each other. 1% is non-family farm, and these family farms produce most of what we eat. It can be 90% of what we eat comes from family farms that's produced in the US. So I think that's a story people don't really know fully. They may be large businesses with, you know, cousins, aunts, uncles, fathers, sons, but they're still family organizations, and they are, in the scheme of big businesses, not that huge. Now, as Kathleen mentioned, there are big ag businesses more on the, you know, food company side, but our farms are largely family-owned businesses. And that's been true 20 years ago. It looked very similar.
And Dr. Bohman, what is the influencing factor? What are the factors on those family farms? Is it technology? Is it trying to form collectives? Is it the opportunity to sell organic, or the challenges of getting certified and labeling? What's affecting their businesses right now?
You know, farming's always been a hard business. You have to deal with weather. They tend to have a lot of capital, land, and equipment.
Weather, right?
So, you know, and have to follow the markets of what to produce, technology advances. So I think it really, people find their niche. And some of it depends on where you live. Some depends on the interest. We see big farms, maybe want one of their children to come, they might form a small part that's organic, or you can't tell one story about farming in the US. It's just a very diverse sector.
Yeah. So right now we're facing a lot of challenges at the farm. You've got climate change. Now, not everybody likes that language. We can soften, we can change out the words, but the reality is weather has always been a challenge for farmers, but it's becoming much more volatile and challenging. Immigration, There's no, especially if you put it under the whole banner of food sector, there's not an industry more dependent on undocumented workers. And right now, we're in free fall because people can't get the labor. And I've talked to a lot of company leaders who are saying, I'm sorry, I gotta leave the US. I can't get the people I need to harvest the crops. And then you have this huge transition of our working lands, where the average age of farmers is about 60 years of age. We've got a lot of farmers over the age of 80. Some of them still milking, if you can believe it. And part of that is because they're searching for that next generation to come and take over those farms. And when that doesn't happen, sometimes that land's developed or it goes into foreclosure, but we need to get that next generation trained. And as Mary said, many of them are not coming from farm backgrounds, so the capital costs that they confront is just unbearable. And then on top of it, they need the training. They haven't grown up with the hands-on helping mom and dad all their lives training, and then they're thrust out of college into these rural areas where they may not have broadband access. Who leaves college and goes somewhere where they can't use their iPhone? I mean, come on. Right. So for us to transition our working lands, we also have to think about it under the broader banner of rural development.
How are we comparing globally when it comes to looking forward to the future, to the next generation of where our food comes from?
Well, the U.S. is a wealthy country in agriculture. We have rich land, we have, overall good rainfall, good climate, and we are competitive in most export markets. So I think so far we've been able to attract the capital, have research developed in the U.S. that's fueled technology, and had people to do farming. So I think right now we are a very competitive sector. Other countries are investing. You see Brazil expanding, China's spending more on research. So it's a dynamic environment, but through past investments and the, good business sense of people, U.S. farming is quite competitive.
And of course you saw rural America with a significant amount of anxiety, and when the new administration came on, saying maybe we need to rethink NAFTA, maybe we don't want TPP, maybe we have to rethink all of our trade agreements. And American agriculture, a lot of the profit is really coming from global trade. So, you have this, some people have described it as a disappearing middle, those sort of mid-sized family farms. And ERS, if you've never gone to ERS's website, I want to do your advertisement for you. There's such an incredible wealth of information, and one of my favorite things they do is called Charts of Note. You can sign up and you get a chart every day in your email that gives you a nice little snapshot of American agriculture. Good advertisement?
Yeah. I'll pay you afterwards, yeah.
So there's just this kind of the small size, diversified, oftentimes young people interested in sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, alternative ways of production, and the very large and getting larger size operation, but that middle is shrinking. And so those larger guys are really, in many cases, very much in the export markets.
Were we underplaying during the political season the importance of agriculture exports? I mean, there's so much focus on trying to shore up the borders and think about where we're bringing in imports and goods from, but were we ignoring where we're sending things like agricultural products to?
Not in the ag community. Agriculture has, for as long as I've been working in the sector since the late 70s, had about 20% of what we produce is exported. It varies from year to year, but that number overall doesn't change very much. And
did you feel like that was part of the political discussion?
Was agriculture part of the political discussion? So I'm a co-chair of AGREE, which is an organization trying to build consensus around food and agriculture policy reform. It's 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans who lead AGREE. And we put out a paper during the campaign saying, hello, world agriculture, food and agriculture, as we say in Massachusetts, wicked important. Hello. There was really, and I was a big supporter of Hillary Clinton. I think people know that, but I think all of the candidates we're rather mute on food and agriculture given its importance in our country's livelihood.
We have a question coming in from Twitter. David is asking, how can we reconcile the policy of America First from the White House and the increased dependency on produce imports from Latin America? And we can certainly also extend that out to the question of undocumented workers.
So we are importing more produce. I think consumers want year-round fresh things like berries, which has been one of the biggest increases. But we've always imported a lot from Latin America off-season, and things we can't grow like coffee and bananas. So I don't know. In the scheme of things, it's not hugely new, but there are some products where the growth is quite dramatic, and berries are the one that stick out in the data.
Yeah, you see over the last several years the trend line for imports and produce, and it's just like this, and it's not anything new with this administration. It's been going on for some time. I think it screams out opportunity for young American farmers, because when you're doing produce, doing fresh product, you can do it on smaller parcels of land. It's a higher value crop, but you need a business plan, you need a market, you need a foot in the door. That's why in the Obama administration, one of the things that we really put a lot of effort on was this initiative we called Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, and trying to look across the many agencies at USDA and the hundreds of programs to figure out how can we help make America great again, shall I say it, by helping these smaller farmers get into, among other things, the produce business. And some of those programs are proposed by the president's budget to be zeroed out. I think they have a lot of support in Congress, and we'll see if we really have to worry at the end of the day. But yeah, I think that there is a lot of opportunity to rebuild the farm sector here, and maybe this will resonate with our new president.
Agriculture has seemed to transcend political parties in many ways. You're from a state that thinks about agriculture issues and you vote accordingly or you don't. Is that still the case? Are we seeing different divisions play out in politics and policy right now?
Yeah.
From where we sit at the Economic Research Service, we think about what are the big issues coming up, and there's a large set that doesn't change from party to party. Interest in technology, interest in risk management for farmers, you see some consensus. But there are issues where things differ, and we see that in some of the discussions that are beginning around the next farm legislation that'll take place in 2018 around the USDA's largest programs, which is SNAP, the formerly known as food stamps.
Let me ask you about the politics before we move on. Do you see the political landscape changing and shifting? Or are we still in that model where red state, blue state, if you're an agriculture state, you tend to vote together, you tend to think about things as a block? Is that shifting?
It's only been recently that it's shifted. I worked for a lot of years on the Hill, and you really hung out with the people who were in your region because you were representing similar crops, similar issues on the farms and ranches. So the Southerners, there were definitely caucuses, and it wasn't D versus R. But what's happening now, I think, is just more taste of the day, the politics, where we have leaders on the floor of the Senate name-calling each other. I mean, I worked there back then when women weren't allowed to wear anything but a dress, and there was decorum. And so I think it's just, part of it is just sort of the dissolution of civil discourse. And so maybe those parties loom larger in all aspects, but it has, the bipartisan nature of agriculture has been lost a little bit. And I'm just not talking since the last election, but over the last few years.
Helene is asking on Twitter, what can the U.S. do to combat food deserts? Dr. Bohman, do you want to start with that one?
Well, at ERS, we measure where food deserts are located, and it was, and in terms of a food desert, you have to think about what's important. So it's location to a store, but it's also, do people have cars or access to a vehicle to be able to shop we did a survey a couple years ago, and we found that most Americans shop at not the store closest to them, but second or third closest. And so this, a food desert may mean you don't have anything nearby, but it also depends on your access to shop. And we don't see huge differences in the type of stores that low-income and high-income Americans shop at.
Rural versus urban food deserts, basic differences there?
Well, you have to think about, in a rural setting, people are used to driving longer distances. So we measure a food desert at like a mile in an urban setting, 10 miles in a rural setting. And I think the issues are very different in terms of access in those two environments.
Dr.
In
Merrigan.
fact, if I could refer to one of the charts of note recently, I looked at farm-to-school adoption in rural versus urban communities. And you might think, well, having local food in the school system, in the school lunch program, would be more prominent in the rural areas where food is grown more than in the urban areas. Well, in fact, the charts of note tells you quite the opposite story. And part of that is, I believe, because if you live in certain parts of this country, you can go for miles and miles and just see corn and beans, or areas where it's not very diverse, where in a more peri-urban area you might get a lot of mixed fruit and vegetable operations, and they might be doing a little bit of wheat, who knows. But the food desert issue is a tough one, and it's a work in progress.
And I just add one final thing that we found in our research is that getting people to eat healthier diets is a challenge. All Americans, regardless of income, eat too much meat, protein, and too many grains and fats, and not enough dairy or fruits and vegetables. And so that's everybody. And so it's not easy to get people to eat better. There's no one solution such as food access. There's education, information. It's it's an important but hard problem.
You brought up meat. Is the rest of the world still thinking about the American diet and the heavy meat consumption here in America as something to strive for? And what is that meaning in terms of agriculture and of course, sustainability?
There's a great article, okay, I'll be the nerdy professor now. It was in Nature in 2014 by Tillman and Clark. But what they did was they did the projections of what the world will look like, and they looked at it in different dietary ways, like the current diet, a pescatarian diet, a vegetarian diet, that sort of thing. And what they did life cycle analysis, but what they did was they really showed a shockingly scary picture of where we're headed, because I think most people agree as countries' economies improve, meat consumption goes up quite a bit. And so while we are pushing in our country to lower meat consumption, to make it not always the center of the plate, as our wonderful chef Dan Barber would say, make it more of a sideline to the main meal, the rest of the world's going a different way if they can. So it's concerning.
Dr. Bohman, what does that picture look like in terms of sustainability and agriculture? Everything from providing the crops to raise animals that eventually become meat, to the environmental impact and cost.
All right. Well, one thing we know is that the world's population is growing, and it's estimated to be around 9 billion people by 2050. So is that growing by about a third. And so we'll have to, on roughly the same amount of land and the same resources, produce food to feed that higher population. And it won't be in, one country's going to produce all the food. There'll be some trade, increase in production in different places. And it'll take, investments in research for new technology. There's a word out there that some people like, some don't, but I think captures this idea is sustainable intensification. We'll have to be able to use better the resources we have and make them sustainable, or able to continue producing over time to meet this food security goal.
And can I jump on there? I want to really underscore Mary's point about the need for research investments. And I know we're going to go through some rough and tumble times on the budget, but when I look at the challenges in agriculture, they're really profound when you go beyond a couple-year timeline. There's real excitement about the potential of capture of carbon in soil. We need more research on that. We want to figure all of that out. We have new genome editing tools. Some people refer to one aspect of it as CRISPR. There's a whole regulatory side of that we could talk about that I think we need to do, but really exciting opportunities. You've even got people making test tube meat. So we don't want to assume that the status quo is always going to be the case, but we do know that as a country, we have underinvested in food and agriculture research, particularly when you look at some of our competitor countries, China, India, where have you. And I think that there's a growing consensus among agricultural leaders that we need to do something about it, and hopefully that will happen here in the next funding bill or two.
I guess hard to say, though. I mean, you say that with an optimistic, hopefully it may happen, but we're certainly not. I guess there will be a real question as to what the administration wants to invest in, what a Republican-led Congress wants to invest in, and then if they can come to a meeting of the minds on budgets generally, much less for something like this. Do you get the sense that the Trump administration is willing to invest in agriculture and in new technologies, new developments along those lines?
I certainly thought it was interesting that our new Secretary, Sonny Perdue, disowned his own budget proposal, having the budget director say it was composed before he was confirmed, which is true. So he's already signaling a discomfort with what was proposed. So I know that the Secretary is a doctor of veterinary science, he's a governor, and he must have had lots of interaction with some great schools down in Georgia, some great researchers. So I am optimistic. I think it's that important that I'm not going to be anything else.
Do we have a sense of where the United States will be in terms of global leadership in agriculture, development, sustainability over the next 10 years? We're certainly seeing the Trump administration pull back on some leadership roles in the international sphere in other realms. What's the future for our relationship with the developing world and also big agriculture countries that are pushing forward with technology? Dr. Bohman, do you have a sense of that?
Well, I won't speak about the politics, but we do see that it's a global world for food and agriculture. Technologies developed in one country are quickly spread to another. And people, observe how things are working and not working. Now, there's still a great disparity in the yields, like how much corn you get per acre in Africa versus the US. So there's a lot of room for technical assistance, and the US, including colleagues that I have in the Ag Research Service, are working with countries around the world to improve their technology and learn things that'll help us better manage pests and diseases in the US. So right now we're part of a global ag system, and I do think the nature of food and agriculture and the crops we grow around the world are a big driver of keeping an international focus.
Dr. Merrigan.
So I will say one of the heartbreaking things for me in the president's budget proposal was zeroing out the McGovern-Dole program. That to me was a perfect moment of bipartisanship, of great men who had visions. And it's a really important program around the world, particularly for girls, to get them to school. Sorry, it helps it's a school lunch program for other countries that we invest in. And so I think that as we move forward in the new administration, I was in an international meeting the day the Paris decision was announced. I was one of 3 or 4 Americans in a room full of 50 people from around the world. We do need to be thinking about our stature as a global leader and what's really at jeopardy when we make some of these one-off decisions.
I can't let you go without addressing some news of the day. Our colleague Caitlin Dewey, who you'll see on stage in just a few minutes, reported earlier today that the FDA has announced it's delaying indefinitely the launch of these nutrition fact labels, which are showing calorie count in big, bold letters, giving information about added sugars. What happens next with this?
It's just kicking the can down the road, as I understand it, in terms of the implementation date. There's no news from FDA as to when it will have to finally go into effect, the new nutrition fact label. But the reality is There are big companies and Grocery Manufacturers Association that are ready to meet the 2018 deadline that was originally expected, and they may go forward and do it. Right now is a time when we're seeing industry step up in a way that we've never seen before. They're hearing from their consumers, their customers, that they want different products in the marketplace, different levels of transparency and identity preservation, and the companies want to deliver for them.
Dr. Bohman?
I think Kathleen talked about a lot of the issues. We see information that consumers want and what should be on a label and what role should the government play, I think, as an emerging issue. We saw that last year with legislation to have some disclosure of genetically engineered seeds. So I see that as a really interesting research issue that we'll be working on for several years.
Dr. Merrigan, do you think that GMO could be rolled into this in some way? Do you think that this gives big companies more time to fight labeling? I mean, what is this window? Who does this window give an opportunity to?
Yeah, I don't think it's a good thing. Yes, there is some thought that maybe part of the logic to this is providing enough window to USDA to figure out how they're going to implement the GMO labeling rule. I know Secretary Vilsack and his top staff are working really as much as they could on that in the last administration, but they didn't get across the finish line. So maybe part of this is they sync up and maybe it all comes together in 2021 or something like that. But we're all just betting people right now, speculating until we hear more from FDA.
All right, Dr. Merrigan, Dr. Bohman, thank you so much. That's all we have time for.
Thank you.
Thank you.